Hey everybody, it's Caitlin. Welcome back to CoronaChat. Today is Friday, May 1st, and right now on CoronaChat we're doing a mini-series comparing different countries' responses to the coronavirus pandemic. And I explained how we're going to do this comparison on Wednesday, and then yesterday we talked a little bit about South Korea and Singapore, so if you hadn't had a chance to watch those videos, go do that first and then come back. Okay, so today we're talking about the second group of countries, which used short-term lockdowns to get things under control so that they could then reopen with the kind of massive testing, contact tracing, and selective quarantine strategy in place. And at this point, most countries are using some variation on this strategy, but three that have used it very successfully are Australia, New Zealand, and Argentina. And so in addition to talking about this strategy today, I'm going to highlight a few things that these countries did differently than everybody else to help us understand why they're being hailed as success stories right now. So one of the things that we talked about yesterday was the fact that massive testing and contact tracing is very resource intensive, right? We have to test everyone, quarantine everybody who tests positive, and then track down everybody that they were in contact in over the previous few days. And this requires a pretty heavy logistical lift and can quickly become overwhelming, especially if there are many, many cases to keep track of. But if you can keep everyone at home for a while, for example, through a month-long lockdown, you can limit the number of contacts that everyone who's infected has. This means that the virus isn't able to jump to anyone new, and we can break the chain of transmission, right? So then we can focus our resources on dealing with the people who are sick, rather than on chasing down anyone who might have been infected or exposed. The other thing that a month-long lockdown does is to help us identify who's truly sick. So remember that one of the tricky things about SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is that someone who's infected is contagious well before they feel sick. Without a lockdown, that means that people can be, out and about infecting other people while they still feel fine. But with a lockdown, someone who's contagious isn't able to get out and infect so many other people, right? So by the time the lockdown is over, anyone who's infected and symptomatic has already become sick. So we definitely know they have COVID-19. And anyone who is infected but asymptomatic, right, has already recovered by the time the lockdown is lifted and they're no longer contagious. So this allows us to really get a handle on how extensive the spread of the disease was, right? So what have these countries done? New Zealand instituted a month-long lockdown pretty early in the course of the pandemic in that country. And although the Prime Minister issued the lockdown order on March 23rd, which might seem late, right, there were only 100 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in that country at that point. And by acting so quickly, New Zealand was able to nip the epidemic in the bud and cut off the virus's ability to get established in the community. And since the virus isn't actively circulating, New Zealand is now starting to be able to talk about eliminating the virus entirely. So if they can keep up testing, contact tracing, and selective quarantine of anyone who might have been exposed, right, and then require anybody who comes to the country to prove that they haven't been exposed, maybe by requiring them to submit to a 14-day quarantine once they get to New Zealand before they're allowed to move around, right? If they can do all of that stuff, they might be able to make New Zealand completely corona-free. Okay, so in Latin America, Argentina acted very similarly to New Zealand, right? The government instituted a lockdown order on March 19th, actually a few days before New Zealand did, when the country only had 128 confirmed cases. Now, Argentina is not yet talking about reopening the economy. They're still seeing around 150 new cases every day, and they need to do a lot more to get transmission under control. But they're seeing a much slower and more controlled spread than neighboring countries that acted differently. We still need more information to understand what exactly is making this strategy work super well in New Zealand versus pretty well in Argentina, right? It might have to do with density, it might have to do with different things about the population, it might have to do with how well people are adhering to the quarantine, or any of a million other reasons, right? But we should be able to do those kinds of comparisons in the future as we get more information. So Australia took a slightly different approach. They never technically went into full lockdown, but the government shuttered most businesses and banned public gatherings of more than 2 people who didn't live in the same household. So, you could go outside with the people that you live with, but you could only be outside with one other person who didn't live in the same apartment or house as you. And Australia also requires that anyone who enters the country do a quarantine for 14 days. So as soon as you arrive in Australia, you have to stay in quarantine by yourself for 14 days to be able to demonstrate that you are, corona-free, right? Now, Australia waited a little bit longer than New Zealand or Argentina to institute what they're calling extreme social distancing. And they didn't implement this policy until March 29th, when there were already 4,159 cases confirmed in Australia and 15 deaths. But even this later decision seems to be working pretty well. So Australia has already said that they don't think that eliminating the virus is feasible. But they're planning to use the strategy of massive testing, contact tracing, and select quarantine as they reopen to help keep the spread of the virus really minimal. And as I mentioned at the beginning of today's video, right, most countries are using some sort of lockdown to get transmission under control right now, or at least to try to. Right? The big difference between Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, and all the rest of us is about when that lockdown was put into place. Because these lockdowns in these three countries were instituted so early, they helped break the chain of transmission before the virus got established in the community. And this means that if a few people slip up once or twice, and don't completely adhere to the rules of the quarantine, of the lockdown, there's less risk that they're going to have contact with someone who's infected and wind up infected themselves. Right? Versus if you wait until there's widespread community transmission, every one of those mistakes is more risky and ultimately more costly in terms of the spread of the virus. Okay, that's our story for today. I hope you're all able to relax and disconnect a little bit this weekend. And on Monday, we will be back with the long-awaited episode about Sweden, the Netherlands, and herd immunity. Till then, remember, we're all in this together. Stay safe, take care of each other, and we'll talk soon. Bye.